I hope to take you on a journey through this presentation that I have lovingly called Healing Rooted in Compassion. Chante washte unapi chiuzapi tayukshta washte imachiapi. I just said I shake your hand with a good heart. Good thinker woman is my Lakota name. My given English name is Johanna Farmer. My grandparents are Gilbert and Marcella LeBeau. Peter Farmer and Irene Moran are also my grandparents. I come from the Sicangu and Ohinupa bands of the Oceti Sakowin. My grandma Marcella would always introduce herself by saying that she shakes your hand with a good heart. My grandpa Gib was the one who gave me my Lakota name when I graduated from high school. These are important parts of what I carry with me anytime I'm introducing myself. I'm coming to you today from the traditional homelands of the Nakushant people, or as you may better know, Washington, D.C. I live in the traditional homelands of my people, the Paasapar Black Hills of South Dakota. As I was so kindly introduced professionally, I am the Associate Director of the National American Indian Court Judges Association, and I'm trained as an attorney. The association is a national association comprised of tribal justice personnel and others devoted to supporting and strengthening tribal justice systems through education, information sharing, and advocacy. One important part of the work that we do is we talk about how justice systems are very holistic. And so health is one part of the things that we train judges to look at. So we provide training and technical assistance to tribal, federal, and state court judges and personnel with a mission to strengthen and enhance tribal justice systems, tribal communities, and better serve tribal people wherever they are. My work over the last almost 2 decades has been to support tribal communities, and my work at NIJA includes training judges. So I'd like to thank the planning committee and specifically Danielle for asking me to be here today and to share one particularly special story with you. I'm hoping today that for my presentation, you'll be able to take away three things. One, understanding how historical and intergenerational trauma and resiliency connects to the what matters most. And then recognizing how trauma might shape a patient's behavior and health outcomes. And then finally, to communicate and deliver care in ways that demonstrate compassion while reducing re traumatization. Today, I'm going to share these objectives through a story about a little girl from Promise, South Dakota. And I promised myself I wouldn't cry, but I always know that I get a little choked up when I talk about my grandma. So these 5 kids in this picture are my grandparents. The little girl in the hat standing in front of the window is my grandma Marcella. She was born in 1919 in Promise, South Dakota, to Joseph and Florence Ryan. She grew up in this log cabin that was built by her father along the Moro River. Her great grandfather was Chief Joseph Forbear, who was a fool soldier, which is a story for another time. He signed the Treaty of Fort Laramie of 1868 to bring peace to his people. After signing, he was confined to the reservation boundaries. I tell you all of this to give you context to a time not far off in memory. My grandma was born before Native Americans were given status as US citizens. She was also born in a time before diabetes existed in our tribal community. Diseases in our community that we hadn't otherwise suffered from became very common when our diets were changed by reservation life. My grandmother, this picture is another picture of the log cabin. And then this other picture is a picture of my grandma and her 4 siblings, my other grandparents. The early years of my grandma's life, she described as being very wonderful, filled with a lot of love, a lot of joy. But my grandma's mother, Florence, journeyed to the Star Nation early in my grandma's life. Her grandmother then stepped in, Louise, to help care for my grandma and her siblings, but then also journeyed to the Star Nation 2 years later. My grandma would reflect back later in life that if losing both of these, by losing both of these women, her mom and her grandma, at such at an early age, that it shaped her more than she thought she ever really realized. Her father, who wanted to keep all of his children together after his wife had passed away, and thought that education was so important because it was something that someone could never take away from you, sent all of his kids to boarding school after my great grandma Florence had passed away. My great grandfather Joseph wasn't aware that this was a federal government policy that was intended to wipe out Native people. The federal government was using education as a weapon to assimilate. And by 1926, 83% of Native school age children across the country were attending boarding schools. The US government made appropriations available of more than $23.3 billion. That's reflected with inflation adjusted dollars between 1871 and 1969 for the federal Indian boarding school program. The last assimilationist boarding school was closed in the 1980s. So again, not too far off in our memory. For my grandma, her memories of boarding school were sad. She was sent there and they stayed there all year long. And even though her brothers were enrolled in the same school, she never saw them the whole entire year. When she went to boarding school, her hair was cut, and every Saturday they would douse the children's hair with kerosene. She was luckily never whipped because she could speak both English and Lakota. But children who only spoke Lakota were regularly punished. My grandma would talk about that they were educated for half a day and then would work for half a day. So the kind of education that they were getting at the boarding school was not a robust education. And she would tell her father that this was one of the concerns that she had about the education that they were getting at the boarding school. She also would talk about the books that were used in the boarding school. They would teach the children that Native people were dirty, uneducated, uncivilized, all negative things. But the saving grace for my grandma, she said, was the fact that she knew her mother and she knew her grandmother and her grandfather, and that there were no teaching in books that could make her believe all of the negative things, the deplorable things that they would read in the books. She knew those things weren't true. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case for every child that was in boarding school. Some parents would talk about their children coming back from boarding school and hating it, and hating the parents when they came back. And you can imagine the things that they were going through in boarding school, the punishment, the kerosene, all of that really had an impact. This picture on this slide is actually a picture of my grandma at boarding school. So some of the kids didn't make it out of boarding schools. The policy was kill the Indian, save the man, but some of them didn't make it out alive. As the slide mentions, there were a lot of institutions across many states. The slide picture here shows the boarding schools that were identified in South Dakota. There were also similar institutions that what we call day schools, but they had the similar assimilation policies of kill the Indian, save the man. There are at least 74 marked and unmarked grave sites at 65 different school sites across the United States. And there was one boy that my grandma recalled who left in the winter. And if any of you are from South Dakota, you know how cold that winters can get. And he left when it was in the cold of winter because he so badly wanted to get home. Sometimes children who ran away failed to get home. They died frozen out there somewhere in the hills, and all they wanted to do was get home. That's all. They ended up dying alone in the cold or in a blizzard. So, like I said, that boarding school policy of kill the Indian, save the man was sometimes just killing. My grandma ran away one time, but the voice of her dad played in her head that she needed to be a good girl and stay there. My grandpa Mike, my grandma's brother, shared a story with my grandma when he was in his 80s, something he had never shared with her before, but had kept with him about the older boys that were at the boarding school that would rape him. And he never shared that with anyone, I think in part because of shame. And the things that you understand as you study is, a lot of those older boys, that was happening to them. And they were exerting the only power that they had over people that were younger. I'll also share with you a little bit about my grandma. Like I said, she recalls boarding school being sad, but she was lucky enough that she didn't experience whippings because her father was Irish and he spoke English. And so she knew English from the time she was little. But I remember one conversation I had with her, and she was in her 90s at the time. And we were talking about hugging and how my grandma used to hug us, I would say, in proportion to the amount that she felt like we needed it. So sometimes that was a long time, and it was very wonderful. But my grandma didn't hug her children. And she had this realization in her 90s that the reason that she didn't hug her children was that she went to boarding school. She went to boarding school, and there was no one there that would hug her. And so that just wasn't a part of what she learned of how a child is raised. And I think if you extrapolate that out to anyone that had attended boarding school, there were a lot of things that they learned while they were in boarding school that then continued to shape how they interacted with the world subsequently. After boarding school, my grandma went on to become a nurse. She went to train in Pierre, South Dakota. She trained for 3 years before taking a job in Fort Thompson. At Fort Thompson, she met a doctor who had encouraged her and her friend to go out and see the world. So she and her friend moved to Pontiac, Michigan, and the war had just been declared. World War II had just been declared. Pearl Harbor was just behind them. And they were hearing ads every day on the radio that nurses were needed for the war effort. It took about a year before my grandma decided, maybe this is what we should go and do. And so she and her friend applied to the Army Nurse Corps. And so she was enlisted in the Army Nurse Corps to serve in World War II. Back then, there was no basic training. She just went where she was assigned and started working in a hospital immediately. She covered 4 wards in the first Army hospital that she served at in Palm Springs, California. Some of her experience was in the psychiatric ward. she says that it wasn't exactly the kind of thing that she had thought that she would be doing or experiencing as a nurse. She was talking, playing ping pong, reading, trying anything that she could think of to help these men with their emotional problems that they were experiencing. And some of what she talked about was some of these emotional problems weren't that anyone had yet been in war, but that they were thinking about what would happen. My grandma was finally assigned to the 76th General Hospital, and it was activated September 28th, 1942, and they were sent to England in March of 1944. They crossed the English Channel to France 4 months later in July of 1944. And then once it was set up, the 76th General Hospital was moved to Liège, Belgium, where there was 1,000 bed tent that was set up, and she served on the surgical ward, and then sometimes would cover night shifts on the shock ward part of the surgical ward. One night while she was serving in the shock ward, another nurse had told her about a patient, and this patient had to have both of his legs amputated below the knee, and they were very concerned about his mental health. He was very quiet. They were concerned that he might commit suicide, so they took away from him any razors, anything that was sharp. And so this patient, his name was Eugene Roubidou. So my grandma went to go talk with him and found out he was from Rosebud. And she would go and visit him every chance she got, and she would talk to him, and she would offer to write letters home, and he would always refuse. And then one day she went to go visit him, and he was gone. Years later, when she came back, she would ask anyone that was from Rosebud if they knew anyone named Eugene Roubidou. And she became a nurse and was working. And one day there was a training, and there was a woman that came in to do the training about how to fill out these forms. And the thought hadn't crossed my grandma's mind, but the next day she received a phone call from this woman and asked, "Do you know a Eugene Roubidou?" And my grandma said, she took a pause, she choked up, and she said, "Yes, I do." And she said, that woman said, that was her father. Um, and the woman told my grandma that he had been married months and then had two kids and then got divorced, got remarried, and had a very large family. And so a few years later, well, not long after that, my grandma was given his number. And she said it took a while for her to call him, but she picked up the phone and she gave him a call, and she asked, "Do you remember the nurse who came to your bedside in Liège, Belgium?" And he said, "I'll never forget her." And so they got in touch with each other. My grandma brought him out to Cheyenne River like a year or two later to honor him. And she talked about their story and then invited him up to accept an honor. And he walked up on two legs with his prosthetics. Um, and so my grandma, that was the kind of person that my grandma was, and that was the kind of nurse that my grandma was she really went out of her way to take care of others, to understand where people were coming from, to meet people where they were at, to take that little extra time. And when I think about this one patient in particular that she helped in World War II, you just think of the ripple effect of that. Her going over there helped to save him, helped to make him not whole, but to help heal and to be able to come back to live a life, to start a family. Um, he served as a mentor to other veterans who experienced amputations. And it was just this, what she thought at the time was this little way of helping someone else out, just going and talking to them. I always get choked up when I tell that story about her, because every time she told a story, and my grandma lived to be 102 years old, and the month that she passed away, I had taken her to Oklahoma. She got inducted to the Native American Hall of Fame. And before she got inducted, we took a trip to a high school, and she was telling stories to the high school students. And she told the story about Eugene. And it still would choke her up all of those years later. And it still chokes me up to think about just the impact that we can have on another person's life, especially when we take that time to think about what someone might be going through. After she served in the Army, um, she came back to South Dakota. This black and white picture here is my grandma in the dark shirt, and then who I'm named after, her sister Johanna. And then this other picture is my grandma and my grandpa with a few of their children, including my mom. And then this bottom picture is a picture of the Indian Health Services Hospital in Eagle Butte, South Dakota, where my grandma worked. She served as a nurse for over 30 years. Like I said, she had 8 children, including my mom. After she retired, she served on tribal council and got smoking banned in tribal buildings. And this was in the 1980s, which was before smoking was being banned anywhere. But she would, when she served on tribal council, there's a funny story about her going into tribal council meetings, and she would bring a gas mask with her because at the time they were smoking in the council meetings. And so she would put on the gas mask to make a point, to gently shame people into rethinking about how they were operating in their community. Another story I'll tell about my grandma is, as some of you may or may not know, there was flooding that occurred in Rapid City, and my grandma at the time was out in Rapid City, and this was the late 70s. She was out in Rapid City for a training, and when the flooding happened, she went to go offer, her assistance to anyone that needed it. But I use this to say that at that point in time, there were still signs in Rapid City that said, "No Indians, no dogs." And despite there being very blatant racism that was out there, she was willing to lend a helping hand however she could. Like I said, my grandma lived for 102 years. I say she had a life very well lived. If you ever make your way to Rapid City, this picture on the far left is the Nest Hotel Hospital. See, I'm all in the hospital brain, but the Nest Hotel, where they painted a picture of my grandma on the side. And this is my grandma with some of our family below. This picture in the middle is a picture of my grandma with a replicated Ghost Dance shirt. So my grandma had gotten contacted at some point in time that there was a Ghost Dance shirt in Glasgow, Scotland, in one of their museums. And they were looking at getting it repatriated or returned to the Lakota people. So my grandma went over to Scotland, met with the museum staff, advocated for its return, and as part of that, she created a replica that they could place in the museum in place of that Ghost Dance shirt. And the Ghost Dance shirt was returned to the Lakota people and returned to South Dakota. This picture in the upper right, my grandma is sitting there giving testimony to rescind the medals of honor that were awarded to the 7th Cavalry who massacred the Lakota people at Wounded Knee. It was work that she was doing up until she had passed away. This bottom picture is a picture at one of her birthdays. Myself, my sisters, my mom, my cousins, nieces, and nephews all very joyously celebrating her and her wonderful life. I remember at one of her birthdays, she gave me a star quilt to honor me for getting her started on the what she called the speaking circuit, because I had invited her to my second grade class to come and talk about her life and her work that she had done as a nurse in World War II. And so I told her I would gladly take the blame for getting her started on the speaking circuit. And now she can take the blame for getting me started on telling her stories to other people. Um, as I mentioned, my grandma journeyed to the Star Nation when she was 102 years old. This picture on the right is a picture of her when she was a nurse. This picture on the right with the flowers is a picture of her. I think this was her right after her 100th birthday. And part of why I want to tell you about her journey to the Star Nation is, she was a nurse for, served as a nurse for 32 years after she came back from the war. So she served as a nurse for a long time, very familiar with the healthcare system, always supported us being healthy. She used to hang bags of sugar cubes underneath like a can of soda and a Gatorade to show us like how much sugar was in each of these. Her favorite drink was water. So she just really advocated for taking good care of ourselves, for being healthy. And in June of the year that she had passed away, she had been experiencing some pain. And so she had went to IHS and had explained that she was experiencing some pain. And they had done a scan and found a mass in her pancreas. And so they made a referral out for her to go and see a specialist. And months passed, and there was no progress on the referral. And then she finally was like, I am still experiencing this pain. And it was in September of that same year. And so they went and took her back, made another appointment, and she got a scan. And the mass had grown enough to know that it was highly likely that it was cancer. They did a biopsy and found out that it was pancreatic cancer, and they gave her 6 to 8 months to live. She made it to November. Um, But again, I tell you these stories and this story about her, and I think, sometimes I think that she wouldn't she wouldn't appreciate some of this, me telling her some of her like medical stuff, but I think it's important to use as a teaching tool. And I think she would appreciate that. I think she would appreciate teaching about how, even as someone educated in the medical field, how difficult that time was, and how she even still had a hard time advocating for herself when something was going on, and her hesitancy to like be a bother to someone else. And so I think I tell you all of this out of love and kindness for my grandma, and hopefully for you all to have, again, like an understanding about some of the complexities that occur in each one of our stories and each one of the stories of the patients that you might be serving. Um, Trauma is this experience that involves a threat or a trigger to you or a loved one and can be an event that you experience directly or indirectly. The key feature is that trauma overwhelms a person's ability to cope. And so when unresolved, it can have negative long-term effects on functioning and well-being. And again, I'm sharing my grandma's beautiful life and her stories to help show a glimpse into one Native American elder. She did experience trauma. Um, she experienced it when she lost her mom, when she lost her grandma, when she went to boarding school. She experienced it when she served on the front lines in World War II. Um, so it's important to know that everyone experiences trauma and also deals with trauma in different ways. Um, Trauma is common in the general population, but unfortunately, the rates of trauma among American Indians and Alaska Natives is higher. They also experience post-traumatic stress disorder, addiction, and a host of other health, poor health outcomes, higher than the general US population. Many of you already are aware of that. But when we talk about trauma, in particular with Native communities, we need to talk about intergenerational and historical trauma. So when we talk about intergenerational trauma, we're referring to trauma that's passed on from one generation to the next. Even when the next generation didn't directly experience the original traumatic event. So children can inherit the effects of trauma through parenting patterns, some of them shaped by survival, through family narratives, through community stress that occurs, and even through biological changes. And so we see that trauma doesn't end with the person who first experienced, but it can echo forward. And so I think about it, if we just take the one example of my grandma and the hugging. My mom wasn't a big hugger either, and I realized some of that stemmed from the way she was parented by my grandma, meaning she wasn't, told like hugging was a big part of what they were supposed to do. And then historical trauma goes even further. It describes the cumulative and multi-generational collective emotional and psychological injury that's experienced by an entire community. And it's experienced across generations. And it's not just an individual experience, it is experienced by a people. So for American Indian and Alaska Native people, historical trauma includes the devastating impacts of European colonization, forced removal from our homelands, the boarding schools, outlawing of ceremonies and of our language, the separation of families. One of the things I didn't touch on was that there was also a federal policy in the 1950s called the Indian Adoption Act, that adopted Indian children out to non-Indian families. And then additionally, other impacts include the systematic policies designed to dismantle tribal identity, tribal governance, tribal communities. And these weren't isolated events, they were sustained, deliberate policies whose effects continue today. We don't see the contemporary challenges that American Indian and Alaska Native people face. They don't arise in a vacuum. They're connected to this historical and structural context. There's emerging epigenetic research that adds this other important layer, that there are studies out there that show that parents who experience severe trauma, including PTSD, can pass biological stress responses to their children, and that trauma can alter stress hormones and gene expression. And some of these biological changes are transmitted to the next generation. So, trauma awareness can help foster empathy. So, all of this stuff that we talk about, trauma, it's not destiny. It means that history lives in our bodies, in families and systems, and that healing must also be multi-generational, collective, and rooted in culture, connection, and resiliency. Understanding this framework changes how we respond. Instead of asking what is wrong with this individual, we can begin asking what has happened to this individual and what has happened to this community, and how do we start to heal that? So that's that shift, that foundational shift to healing informed and culturally grounded practice. I know there's been a lot of times where it's been trauma informed, but I was enlightened recently when one of my colleagues said, let's start calling it healing informed care. Trauma can lead to a lot of different things, and it does have an impact on the care that individuals look at receiving. So it can be difficult to deal with scheduling, to keep appointments, to making appropriate judgments about risk. And trauma can cause people to, disconnect from strong negative emotions and to disengage when they're experiencing triggering experiences. So there could be a distrust of institutions, a fear of authority or documentation, a reluctancy to disclose personal informations, or heightened sensitivity to a loss of control. But it isn't all bad. One of the things is, as much intergenerational trauma and historical trauma that our Native American communities have faced, that resiliency also lies in our communities. So we're able to manage stress and function better, and connecting to family and community and culture. We're all connected, and we come together. So as many times as something bad happens, we're there to support each other as families. And these values, beliefs, and practices are then passed on as a source of strength, power, of medicine, and of healing. So my grandma, even identifying that she had gone through these things and being able to talk about them, really shows that she was trying to shift the way that we even saw what she had experienced, and to change some of our own patterns and to look at ourselves. So finally, healing informed care. What does that mean? So for creating safety, physically, emotional, and cultural safety. So what does that mean? Clear explanations before exams or procedures, asking for permission to touch, maintaining privacy and modesty, minimizing rushed interactions as much as you can, being mindful of how the room is set up, This can help address that distrust of institutions, or, looking at how elders might have looked at hospitals as past systems of control. Um, so safety isn't assumed, but you're establishing safety as you work. And then to build trustworthiness by reducing uncertainty and power imbalance. So elders who have experienced betrayal, personal or institutional, can scan for inconsistencies or hidden agendas. So what this looks like is explaining the why behind your making recommendations, being clear about documentation and confidentiality, following through on commitments, naming limitations honestly, using simple phrases like, here's why I'm recommending this, or here are the options, let's decide together. That transparency can really help reduce anxiety and improve adherence of the patient to the care. Restoring our autonomy when possible. So, aging, illness, and hospitalization often reduce autonomy, as you all know, and trauma can magnify the distress of the loss of control. So, even micro choices matter. So, would you prefer to sit or lie down? Is it okay if I examine your shoulder now? Would you like a family member to be present? Choice doesn't mean abandoning that clinical judgment. It means offering control where it's clinically safe to do so. So even these small choices can help restore dignity. And then shifting from this authority to partnership, traditional Western medicine can feel very hierarchical, but healing informed care reframes the medical staff as partners rather than the director of the care. So, again, inviting them in to help decision making when they can, including family or caregivers appropriately and respecting their lived experiences. So instead of saying, this is what we're doing, try, here are the options, what feels most manageable to you. Partnership can improve that engagement and trust. Elders have survived decades of challenges, loss, systematic discrimination, illness. So trying to tap into strength-based questions like, what has helped you through difficult times before? Who do you rely on when things are difficult? What feels most important to you right now? Recognizing elders as knowledge holders and cultural anchors and sources of resilience in our families. Recognizing that resiliency can shift the tone of the care that you're providing. And then finally, this ongoing self-reflection. You don't need to be an expert in every cultural tradition, but you do need an awareness of the historical harms of health systems, the impacts of boarding school relocation or systematic discrimination, some of the cultural differences in communication and decision making. So practically ask, don't assume, invite discussion. That humility builds trust and assumptions don't damage. And in my last minute here before I open it up for questions, I'd just like to leave you with this kind of one thought, that Western science is catching up to Indigenous wisdom. And I'll give you one example. As Lakota people, we believe that 7 generations ago were thinking about us, and that we should think 7 generations ahead of us. So when we think about intergenerational and historical trauma, those things are true. And the one other example that I'll give to you about Western science catching up to Indigenous wisdom is the example of that a woman is born with all the eggs that she'll ever have. And so I lived in my grandma's womb when my mom was in her. And so there's just that connection right back to my grandma again. As I close out, I just like to say something that I think my grandma did a great job of, was being a good relative. And so think about that when you're serving your patients is if this was my relative, how would I treat them and how would I want them to be treated?